Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kelly Surtees webinar on the 2021 forecast. This is Kelly's annual forecast webinar. Really, it's a really fun annual tradition, and super psyched to have all of you here and to have Kelly here to present this material. Thanks for joining us, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Tony. Thanks for having me. And thank you to everyone for joining us on this holiday weekend in many parts of the world. There's lots to talk about for the astrology of 2021. So I think we'll dive right in. Is there anything else we need to clear up as we're getting started, Tony, or we are good to go?
I think we're good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump in with the screen share, and in the spirit of fresh starts and new beginnings, which is a big theme in 2021, I've redesigned my presentation layout, and we'll see how we go with that. So just bear with me if I'm adjusting to the newness there. And for all the Marys in the audience and for everyone else, I wanted to start with a couple of quotes by one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, today. And these are quotes that I think can be useful to keep in mind as we contemplate 2021. So the first quote is a very well-known one, which says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And I wanted to use this quote because there is a theme astrologically of wildness and of things being a little bit maybe unpredictable or up in the air or going through this kind of rapid process of change and transition. And we see that in the astrology, particularly with the Saturn square Uranus aspect, which we'll dive into as part of today's presentation. But if we take a moment to connect in with our individual relationship to this concept of wild, are you comfortable when you have wild moments? Do you give yourself permission to make decisions that might be wild or lead to freedom? And honoring that life is precious, considering how much of that wonderful, wild, free exploration you might want to add in. And that's something just to keep in mind as you're navigating life and contemplating choices and decisions over the next 12 months. The other quote is maybe a less well-known one, but one that I really like, also by Mary Oliver, which says, "Instructions for living a life." And there's just three things that Mary Oliver suggests: pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And the piece there that really caught my eye as I was contemplating 2021 was this idea of being astonished. To be astonished is to be amazed and surprised. And I wondered how many of us are still amazed and surprised and even delighted with where life takes us, and how many of us don't ever get astonished or surprised or amazed or delighted about life anymore because there is so much maybe routine or repetition, or perhaps there's a lot of fear or worry. And so these are kind of big, bold quotes, but there is a big, bold undercurrent to the astrology of 2021. And I wanted to start with these to set a quality of intention or energy that, if you feel ready or willing, this could be a year where you make a wild and freeing choice for yourself, or you go towards a path that might amaze and delight you, even if it's not the path that you thought you might take. So these are some of the things we can keep in mind as we contemplate the year ahead. We'll have a few more themes and ideas as we go, but just to get us in the mood for now, I wanted to get started with that. Okay. All right. So our intention today with our webinar and our time together is to have a look at the highlights astrologically of 2021. A whole 12 months to cover in just 90 minutes means I can't give you every detail about what's happening in the next 12 months, but I do want to highlight what I think will be some of the main astrological signatures for the next 12 months. So we're going to talk about what they are, what they might mean. We're going to have a little look, and I'll provide you with some tips about how to connect what's going on in the sky with your own birth chart. This won't be a totally personal year ahead reading for you, if you like, individually. We're going to be dancing between collective cycles and personal experiences. So you will definitely get a lot of tips and ideas about what's going on astrologically in 2021. And depending on your level of understanding with astrology, you'll come away with some understanding of how this is going to impact your own personal birth chart. That piece of connecting what's happening in the sky in 2021 to your personal birth chart is something that is best done in a more intimate setting, so in a consult or in your own studies. But I want to give you a few tips and guiding points as we go today. In addition to talking about some of the collective themes, we've got a couple of example charts where I'll show you how these cycles might show up in the life of an individual. And hopefully that will be part of how you can find your way with applying the cycles of 2021 to your own chart. And of course, more importantly, to your own life. Just to give you a sense of where that's going. So here we go. Let me just minimize a few things there. I wanted to give you the big stuff up front, and then we're going to break things down into pieces. And covering year ahead themes, even in a consult as well as in a teaching environment like this, is a bit of a weaving process where we are dancing between big picture collective themes, some of the personal detail, the macro and the micro. So we're weaving between different points of view and different perspectives as we go, if you like. Okay, I just want to make sure I've got the slide. That's good. So there is a lot of activity in the zodiac between the degrees of 7 and 13 degrees of Taurus and Aquarius specifically. And that's also going to flow into the 7 to 13 degree range in Leo and Scorpio. That's got a lot to do with the Saturn square Uranus, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly. But just to get you starting to think about the degrees in the zodiac that I call the hotspot degrees for the year ahead. If those degrees are significant in your personal chart, maybe your sun or moon or Venus is between 7 and 13 degrees of any of the fixed signs, maybe your ascendant or midheaven is, then you know that that particular thing happening in the sky astrologically is going to be quite impactful for you personally. We've got a sequence of eclipses happening this year, primarily in the signs of Gemini and Sagittarius. So we've got eclipses happening at 5 degrees and at 12 degrees of Sagittarius. We've also got an eclipse happening at 19 Gemini and about 27 Taurus. So those degrees might be important for you. And if those degrees aren't, those zodiac signs, Gemini, Sagittarius, and Taurus, will certainly represent houses and therefore topics in your birth chart that are going to be stirred up or churned around by the eclipses. Jupiter is moving through the entire sign of Aquarius in 2021, which is a welcome change from a technical perspective to Jupiter's condition in 2020. But the best thing that Jupiter has to offer us this year in 2021, and the piece that I'll focus on, is that Jupiter will spend a couple of degrees and a couple of months early in the sign of Pisces. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail as part of today's presentation about why that's so good and what we can do to take advantage of that. So if you have planets or angles like your ascendant, midheaven, descendant, or IC at the very earliest degrees in Pisces, 0, 1, and 2 degrees of Pisces, this is going to be a very good thing for you personally. We do have a Venus retrograde in the sign of Capricorn this year, and that Venus retrograde will cover the middle part of the sign of Capricorn from 11 to 26 degrees. And so if you have planets specifically in Capricorn between those degrees, then this Venus retrograde will be important for you. If you don't have planets in those degrees, which will be most of us, we will still have Capricorn in a particular house in our birth chart, and we want to pay attention to how the Venus retrograde might stir that up. So we'll talk a little bit about that in detail as well. So there are some of the hotspot degrees that I wanted to list for you, almost like a cheat sheet of where the main astrological activity is happening in 2021. It's where it's happening in the zodiac. And if you can find those parts of the zodiac in your personal chart, you're going to have a great insight into where a lot of the astrological activity is going to be stirring up your life this year. Now, even if those specific degrees aren't relevant for you, the zodiac signs of Gemini, Sagittarius, Taurus, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Pisces have all got a fair amount going on in them this year. And so if you pay attention to the houses where you have those particular zodiac signs, you're also going to get a sense of some of the main themes for you personally. So this is a bit of a, here's what's going on in the sky. And if you can find this part in your chart, that's how you'll get the personal link to that. So to get us started, I want us to keep in mind that 2021 is a really unusual year in the sense that we are just starting this major new Jupiter-Saturn cycle. We just had Jupiter conjunct Saturn at early Aquarius in December 2020. And you've probably heard a fair bit about this, but it's important in terms of giving context to what 2021 is all about. It's the start of a new 20-year Jupiter-Saturn cycle. So that's an important medium to longer time frame cycle for each of us to know that whether you were aware of it or not, the period from 2000 to 2020 was its own Jupiter-Saturn chapter. And some of the themes, just you don't even have to get into a lot of the astrological nitty-gritty in your chart in your life. But if you just think about that period of time as a chapter or its own little story, the next 20 years starts now. And so when we think about 2021, it's important to understand that it is the very early seeding or beginning of a longer cycle. And there is the longer cycle just of Saturn in Aquarius, for instance. That's the change. We haven't had Saturn in a new sign for 3 years. So there's this 2 to 3 year Saturn coming into Aquarius cycle, which is fresh and different. There's the 20-year Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle. And then there is an extra significance to the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which is that this particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction represents the start of a 180-year air elemental cycle. So we have a 2-year Saturn in Aquarius cycle, a 20-year Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and a 180-year air cycle beginning. So on many levels, on major, long dynastic level cycles, on those medium level cycles, and then on those short level cycles, 2021 is a reset year. So if we think about this idea as a fresh start, a year of new beginnings, when we start something new, we've got a clean slate. Sometimes we're carrying some baggage, which could be habits or behaviors, fears, ingrained ways of thinking or operating, maybe a schedule or a routine or a set of responsibilities. When we bring all of that history with us to this beginning point astrologically. And part of our role individually for everybody in 2021 is to sift through all of our baggage and our past and our patterning and our training and our skills and our talents and think about what of these pieces do I want to carry forward into the next cycle? And which of these pieces, which of these cycles or responsibilities or routines or duties, what have I outgrown? What do I need to leave behind? And so 2021 is a beginning and a year of great transition as we're all sorting through what needs to be left behind and what's going to be carried forward. So point number 3 in this sort of flow chart talks about the fact that we're going to need new structures, new systems, and new processes, as well as fresh priorities for these next cycles. And we're going to see the shift and the kind of rumble and the upheaval of that happening collectively. But I want to invite you to think about this personally. How can you update the way that you live? How can you change some of the things that you do every day unconsciously, for instance? So we might think about 2021 as a year where there's an out with the old and an in with the new. And your opportunity to bring some mindful awareness to this cycle is to think about what you might want to kind of co-create if you were collaborating with the cosmos. What do you want to bring in? And it'll be important to think about themes of freedom, authenticity, and independence. So at the personal level, it's about changing some of our structures or routines or even responsibilities so that we can be a bit more authentic and we can have a little bit more freedom. That's kind of our starting point here. So that's our big conceptual piece, just to understand where 2021 sits in the larger scheme of things. The air element, which is big because we're starting this new 180-year air cycle, but even more literally, we have a lot of planets doing a lot of things in air signs in 2021. We have both Jupiter and Saturn, which are traditionally the major chronocrators or markers of time. Both Jupiter and Saturn will spend all year in an air sign, and Jupiter will spend about 9 months of 2021 in Aquarius. The Mercury retrogrades in 2021 will also be in air signs. So Mercury is going to spend a lot longer in air signs this year as well. So we're all getting a bit of a crash course into the mood and the qualities and the tendencies of the air element. Now, the air element is considered to be the most humane element, and the air signs collectively represent human intelligence, the kinds of community and communication skills that humans have created. The air signs also represent technology, ideas, information, and air as an element represents movement. And this is one of the big tone changes from 2020 into 2021. We've had a lot of earth energy, which is stuck or stable or focused on accumulation. That's been the past. And as we come into 2021, movement and this concept of things dispersing or scattering in the wind becomes really important. So the idea with this strong air focus is it's about connection, it's about collaboration, and it's about community. And one of the best ways that we can create or even connect with a community is by thinking about what kind of contribution we'd like to make. So there is this need to make changes that give you more freedom and autonomy in your own personal life so that you have time or energy or space to support or contribute to a community that matters to you. This is kind of how we weave together the themes of this year. It's a lot about interacting with our fellow humans and seeing the humanity in all of us. But the key about movement, I wanted to just speak to that very briefly. The image that I'm working with around movement and at an elemental level, how does it all fit together, is the idea of the sand dunes. And in the summertime, in the middle of 2020, here in Europe, we had a little bit more freedom where the pandemic situation was just sort of okay for a moment. And we were able to do a little bit of traveling on the continent here. And one of the things we went to see was the Dune du Palais, which is the tallest sand dune in Europe. And it was fascinatingly beautiful. It's on the kind of northwestern coast of France. And one of the things I learned when we were there is that this sand dune is moving, not quickly and not under your feet in an obvious way, but over a period of decades, the wind is blowing the sand back from the sea. And so it's almost encroaching on the sand dune is encroaching onto the forest behind it. And that stayed in my mind. And as I've got closer to thinking about all of these air themes for 2021 and beyond, it's reminded me of the power of wind or air to shape things that have matter or form. And air could be literally a breeze or a wind, but it can also be ideas, whether that's intelligence or just that idea of inspiration, so that our ideas have the potential to shape matter and form. And if you're frustrated with the matter or the form or the shape, the physical shape and the time sort of systems that you have in your life, which are all earth things, you may be lacking some fresh ideas. And we're all going to get a plethora, a flood of ideas coming through over this next period with the air element being so emphasized. And so with so many ideas coming in, once we start thinking about things differently, we want to shape things differently. And that's sort of a bit of a metaphor of the wind shaping the sand dunes and how wind and symbolic expressions of wind, ideas, or even interactions. You think you're going to approach a situation one way, and then you have a conversation or you connect with someone, and the way you think about it changes, and therefore what you do is different than if you had never had that conversation. So the other thing that I've thought about as a little bit of a metaphor for 2021 as we come into it is the idea of those sliding doors moments. Many of you might have seen that movie with Gwyneth Paltrow about, if you get on the train, life goes in this direction. And if you don't get on the train, different events happen. So it's not to say that everything in 2021 is a sliding doors moment, but the things that do come through or that you connect with or the ideas that you engage with this year will definitely shape what comes next for you. So, with so much air about, it's important to feed your brain with high quality ideas and information, whether that's reading poets or philosophers or wisdom teachers of any kind. This also comes up with the South Node moving through Sagittarius, which we'll talk a little bit more about. A little later today. I could talk about the air element and Aquarius for, a whole day, but I think that's given you a few ideas about how to approach this air vibe. Movement is important. We're going to see dispersal. So we're going to see maybe a flight out of cities, if you like, into more community hubs. And so we call them in Australia, central business districts, CBDs. But, things like everyone's not going to be in New York anymore. We're going to see more of that movement out to smaller centers that maybe are still accessible to a city, but could give a better quality of life. So that's interesting to keep in mind. That, I think, is partly a focus on air, which definitely talks about dispersing and moving people and resources around. But it's also very specifically the 2021 dynamic between Uranus in Taurus and Saturn in Aquarius. It's movement and changing relationship to land, which is going to be part of this dynamic. To bring this a little down to the personal for the moment, one way to start thinking about all of this air energy, but if we center it onto Aquarius, because that's the big focus for 2021, is for you to really get clear on the topics of your Aquarius house and what they're all about and what you might need to do or not do in that area of your life. So at the very least, just thinking about, okay, where is Aquarius for me? And how do I need to do a combination of Saturn and Jupiter here? Because we know that with Saturn in your Aquarius house, there will be some endings. You will be graduating into new levels of responsibility. There'll also be a need to complete things or to finish things. But with Jupiter in the Aquarius part of your chart as well, you're ready for growth. You're ready for new understandings. You're ready to develop your experiences in this area of life. So there is a combination of consolidation and simplifying, which is Saturn, along with that willingness to try a few new things because we need those outside of our comfort zone experiences to have the growth. You can think about your Aquarius house as a part of your chart or your life that is starting. It's got a very unique 12-month cycle. It's about 60 years since we had Jupiter and Saturn together in Aquarius. So this is an unusual double up combination. And most of us will only have this once in our lifetime, Jupiter and Saturn together in Aquarius. It's also the start of a 2-year chapter with Saturn moving through Aquarius, because Saturn will be in Aquarius until about March of 2023. And I did mention that this particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction does start this 20-year Jupiter-Saturn cycle. So depending on your age and stage of life, you might also want to think about, how do I want to relate to the Aquarius parts of my chart over the next 20 years? And what can I do in the next 2 years to really get anchored in there? What do I need to master or complete or figure out so that I can get more out of this part of my life in the decades to come? So that's something to think about, just really diving deeply into that Aquarius part of your chart. Okay. Now there's a bunch of example charts. We'll come back to them a little further into today's presentation. I wanted to make a couple of specific points to do with Saturn in Aquarius. This is a little bit of a caution, but also a call to action. When we get traditionally malefic planets like Mars or Saturn in an air sign, what I've noticed is we get a lot coming up about the mind, about mental health, and about managing our thinking. You know, those conversations that we're always having with ourselves. That's going to be a huge focus over the next couple of years. The caution is to be aware that your mental health affects everything, and that you might want to be a little bit more diligent or dedicated about good mental health self-care practices. So one of the tendencies with Saturn in Aquarius is that Saturn in any air sign, I should say, we do get more going on in the mind. We could get some melancholy or some heavier thoughts, but we can also get thinking that has more gravitas and more substance. I was really struck when I was looking at one thing I like to do when I'm trying to get a good handle on a planet in a sign combination, or particularly for a teaching perspective. I like to have a look at people who have that planet and just see what have they given, how does their life maybe exemplify a piece of that? And some of the Saturn in Aquarius individuals or people who have this, Gloria Steinem, we're going to look at her chart a little bit today, Kamala Harris, Anaïs Nin, for those of you who are familiar with her writing, Rilke and Nietzsche, both also great thinkers and writers, Marsilio Ficino, a medieval Renaissance astrologer and magician, also had Saturn in Aquarius, Leonard Cohen, George Westinghouse, who was involved in the early developments of electricity and things like that. So there is definitely this idea of thinking. Saturn in Aquarius is about solid, substantial thinking, about coming up with ideas or concepts that will stand the test of time. But the caution is that we don't want to get too stuck in our heads. We're going to be doing a lot more longer term thinking and planning. That's the nature of having Saturn in an air sign. We're going to have to balance the worry and the concern about what might happen or will things come together with the need. We know that Saturn in an air sign is we need to make longer term plans. We do need to think things through. We need more preparation. We can't do things like flying by the seat of our pants. From a caring for your mind perspective, really be conscious about quality control. Thinking about enhancing the quality of what you take in is going to increase the quality and the caliber of the ideas and the conversations that you're able to contribute to. So it's very similar. Our minds are the same as our bodies. If we eat junk, we feel like crap. But if we take in quality information, our mind kind of naturally raises its I don't want to say intelligence necessarily, but we just start thinking about more powerful ideas that can make a bigger contribution. So you might be making assessments or reflections on things like social media versus published material in books or training courses, for instance. You might be juggling the Saturn in Aquarius versus Uranus in Taurus piece of how much am I in my head versus how much am I in my body. Saturn in Aquarius can be very in the head and can sometimes isolate or disconnect as a result of that. Uranus in Taurus is very much about being in the body and being in nature, as well as having in-person experiences. I know there are a lot of restrictions around those now, but hopefully by the time we're done with Saturn in Aquarius, we will be able to interact much more in person. And I would highly recommend that you take that opportunity anytime you can. It's better to balance the energy that we've got to do that. It's also just better for us psychologically and physiologically, if we can, if it's safe to do so, to have some of those in-person connections. I think we're also going to see a lot of conversation with Saturn in Aquarius about air quality and about the importance of breathing, how to breathe properly, how to breathe deeply into all sort of parts of the torso and the body. So that's another reason why being outside is going to be helpful, because fresh air is always better than inside air. So there's some literal things about this air focus in terms of air quality. How do we improve the air that's available to us? Think about limiting the type of information and interactions that you have so that you're not saying yes to everything, but you are choosing some quality experiences or information sources that are going to feed and enhance your life and your mind, if you like. The Jupiter and Pisces transit, which we'll get to a little bit later today, is definitely going to be a nice soothing balm to mellow out some of the very heady energy of Saturn in Aquarius. So there'll be a period in the middle of the year from mid-May to late July where you might notice this Saturn in Aquarius stuff kind of softens a little bit. But I just wanted to share some of these general points about Saturn in Aquarius, given that we're now diving into this as a theme. And because we've had Saturn in Aquarius for a few weeks now as we're recording, some of you may be already starting to think along these lines. So keep these points in mind in terms of quality in, quality out for our mental state. So now we're getting to this major theme of 2021. We have a huge astrological aspect forming, Saturn square Uranus. And this is going to shape the year for sure. For sure. It is an aspect that is symbolically about dramatic upheavals. It is the symbolism of this aspect is about things that are unstable or erratic. If I'm working with a client and they're having a transit Uranus to natal Saturn aspect, we know that they're going through some big change in at least one core area of their life. I often think about Saturn as representing the foundations or the pillars in our life, the areas of our life where we kind of fall back on or we kind of look to for security and stability. When Uranus and Saturn interact, things that we expect to be solid and stable are not temporarily. So one of the concepts of Saturn square Uranus is freedom through change, or if we turn that around, it's change that leads to freedom. Now, the concept of change, we all have a different relationship to the idea of change. So think about how you handle change, whether you get excited by change, whether you get scared by change. 2021's major signature, Saturn square Uranus, definitely speaks of like roller coasters or tectonic plates kind of shifting. And this doesn't have to be in every area of your life, but it is going to be in a couple of areas. It's important to remember that this is an aspect about freedom, and that often involves freedom of choice or having to rebel or push back against restriction and tradition. So think about the ways in your life that you feel unnecessarily restricted, where you feel you are limited without sort of adequate compensation, for instance. There are things we all have to do that we don't love. You know, I don't love cleaning the cat litter twice a day, but I love the joy that I get from my cat. So that's like a small trade-off for me. There are components of your job or your family life or even a relationship that you have that might not be fun, but the overall trade-off is fantastic. But I want you to think about those situations in your life where the trade-off is no longer fantastic, where you're feeling burdened and limited, where you feel like you can't grow, that you are now pushing against the limits of your experience and you're getting stuck. If you have those feelings of stuckness or frustration, this is a clue that we need to have this kind of outburst or explosive push through. Saturn square Uranus can indicate a breakthrough. Sometimes a breakthrough is preceded by a little bit of a breakdown. So if you get overstimulated or spread too thin, that's going to be a clue that we need to radically reshape what's going on for you. I personally think the ultimate goal of a major aspect like Saturn square Uranus is to encourage each of us to step towards authenticity. It's about finding freedom. Sometimes we have to fight for that. And it's going to have parts of 2021 are going to have this very scary, exciting, stimulating, unfamiliar, nerve-wracking vibe all at the same time. You know, when you're about to do something that's really amazing, but you can be so scared, even though you want to do that thing? I think that's the best case scenario here. There are some of us that are going to deal with surprises or shocks that are unexpected. We can't ignore that given the involvement of Uranus here. But I always believe that when we have these big changes, you know, there's an opportunity to change more than just where the change starts. I keep coming back to a book title. I've never read the book, but this title gets me every time Uranus stuff comes up, because when I had major Uranus transits in my own life, this transit is this, I call it a quote, but it's technically a book title, is what got me through. And this quote is, "When everything changes, change everything." And so, you know, some of you are going to be very resistant to this idea of change and upheaval, and some of you are going to be excited by it. And I'd invite you to explore your relationship to change and to see which changes, even if it's just tiny, you might feel comfortable to at least dabble in or dip your toes in this year. And I can see some conversation in the chat about this, which is great. From a personal perspective, you can think about your Aquarius house and your Taurus house as being the two topics in your life that are kind of ready for the roller coaster or ready for the refreshing change of, to bring more freedom, you might deal with some tension between the Taurus part of your chart and the Aquarius part of your chart. So think about the topics there and see whether it's like, well, I want to do this. Somebody mentioned 10th house, 7th house as how this square is going to interact with their chart. That can be a sense of, well, this is what my career is pulling me towards, and this is what my relationship is kind of demanding of me. How am I going to change things to try and juggle or do this differently? And so I can see it's good. This is going to be great for you all to share your stories here. So let's get some dates and data. We've talked a lot about sort of the symbolic feeling of Uranus, Saturn. The exact activations are February 17, June 14, and December 24. The degrees where these squares will take place, if we get really specific, the first one is 7 degrees, Aquarius, Taurus. The second one is 13 Aquarius, Taurus, and the third one will be 11 Aquarius, Taurus. It's simple to say, or to summarize, I should say, if you have planets between 7 and 13 degrees of any of the fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, or Aquarius, they're going to be swept into this Uranus square Saturn aspect for 2021. I've highlighted the 3 months where this transit will be at its strongest or its exact activation. But this is where I want to bring in the importance of Mars in the fixed signs in 2021. Mars is going to be moving through 3 of the 4 fixed signs. Mars will be in Taurus at the start of the year, January, February, in Leo in the middle of the year, June, July, and Mars will be in Scorpio later in the year, October, November. I think it's October, November, but it just quickly double check. And that is going to kind of amplify and keep the heat under this Saturn-Uranus square. I beg your pardon, Mars in Scorpio, November, December. So even though the exact activations are February, June, and December, experientially, with the combination of Mars coming in, we're going to see a lot of Mars, Uranus, Saturn, like a trio coming together in January and February, in June and July, and then again in November and December. So it is, and I've just listed 6 months out of the calendar year. So that's what I mean. This is our major story. Whether we love the sound of this story or we're a little bit freaked out by it, we are all here at this moment in history to explore what we can do with the shifts and the symbolism that's coming forward from here. So think about Saturn Uranus as a longer trend that we're all dancing with. Pay special attention if you have planets near these degrees. So between 7 and 13 degrees in any of the fixed signs, you will essentially be having a Saturn transit and a Uranus transit at the same time. Now, when I work with clients, that is always a clue that we're dealing with something significant and fairly major in terms of personal growth and changes. We have Saturn transits and we have Uranus transits, and we don't usually have them to the same parts of our chart at the same time. In the same way that some of our cardinal sign friends in 2020 were having Saturn and Pluto transits at the same time, and that was a very unique experience. Some of our fixed sign planets are going to have Saturn and Uranus together in 2021. I don't think this is about insurmountable opportunities. I think it's about breaking free. There's a liberating quality in Saturn Uranus that I think ultimately can bring you to a place that you're happy to be in, even if the process of removing the shackles is uncomfortable or you don't like it while you're in it. Things that look like a stabilizing situation, like this feels safe or I feel good here, after a while, it can start to feel like you're imprisoned by it. And Uranus is going to ask all of us to question the responsibilities and routines and rituals in our lives, just to make sure that some of them haven't become prisons without us realizing it. And if so, they're the things we're going to be needing to change. So 2021 is a combination of Mars, Uranus, and Saturn. And that is going to create some dramatic energy that has this sort of boiling, bursting, and breaking free kind of quality. It's also about agitation and things being stirred up. So the idea of, 2021 being a year where everything stays the same, probably not what's coming through with these particular planetary combinations. So things might be unsettled. And if you can think about planning on like 3 month or 6 month timelines, that's going to help you navigate the sort of constantly changing or developing situation that the Mars Uranus Saturn can create. Authenticity, liberation, excitement, the opportunity to break free of old chains and limits is definitely there. And the more that you can lean into the right choice for you, even if other people think that's unusual or why are you doing that? Of the planets involved here, I interpret this as Uranus being the dominant signature or the dominant theme. And Uranus is about finding the right way forward for you, like the idea of you do you. And there's a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote that I love for Uranus, which is, do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. So that's what I mean by this sort of groundbreaking, or, going in Australia, we call it bush bashing, where you go off the path and you're just finding your own way. And it is wild and it's completely freeing. And you're often, trusting your instincts, and, you've just got to figure it out one step at a time. You don't have to do that all year, but particularly in those months where this Mars Uranus Saturn combo is strong. Hey, Tony.
Hey there, Kelly. Could you do me a quick favor and just check to see if you've got automatically adjust volume checked off, and just make
I
sure it's
don't think
unchecked?
so.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's got to do with how close. Sorry, I just muted myself by accident. It's got to do with how close I am with the microphone.
Oh, okay. Is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah. Let me double check.
Under audio
How's that?
settings. Was it unchecked?
It was checked because
That's what it is. Yeah.
different people that I work with have different requirements.
Yeah, when it's checked in a webinar, the volume goes up and down.
Okay.
So,
Is that better?
Yeah. Much better. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent. Yeah. Very, very Uranus of us to tweak our tech in the middle.
Yes.
I love it. So that's our major vibe for next year. Let's take a little look at one chart that is going to be stirred by this, and also perhaps represents a little bit of this energy anyway. So Gloria Steinem does have Saturn in Aquarius. So there are some themes of Saturn in Aquarius that come through in her life and her life experiences and her general story. So there's that piece. But if we think about what is directly triggering her chart in 2021, and how is this going to feature, if you like, then we get into really the personal transit piece. And we can see that Gloria does have some planets and some important chart points in those hotspot degrees between 7 and 13 degrees of the fixed signs. We've got the moon at 7 Leo, and the ascendant descendant axis at 12 degrees Scorpio, 12 degrees Taurus. So for her personally, we're going to see Uranus move over the descendant. Uranus has already been squaring the moon, which makes sense. We just had a movie released about Gloria Steinem's life that came out in 2020. And that movie was first, the development and the project, that movie about her life, was first announced back in 2018, shortly after Uranus moved into Taurus. And Uranus has gone through the square to her moon in 2020. And we've had that film come out. So that's most of us will not have a movie made about our lives, but the idea of things being stirred and triggered. Obviously, Gloria Steinem is someone who is a lifelong feminist and activist. And so we're seeing the themes, if you like, of some of this Saturn in Aquarius, collaboration, community involvement, making a contribution. They're so strong in her natal chart, but we're seeing even more of that coming forward at the moment. So in addition, though, we will have those Saturn transits. We're going to have Saturn come through the early part of Aquarius. So the hotspot degrees for Saturn in 2021 will be from 1 to 13 degrees of Aquarius. And so if you have any planets between 1 and 13 degrees of any of the fixed signs, you'll have a Saturn transit this year. Gloria Steinem will have Saturn, transiting Saturn will oppose the moon and will also square that ascendant descendant axis. So triggers to the moon can bring up some health stuff. The moon is in the whole sign 10th house for Gloria. So that can also bring up some professional opportunities or themes and topics. And there's a lot of activity to the ascendant descendant axis in Gloria's chart for 2021 with Saturn squaring and Uranus on the descendant. So the way she's relating to other people is likely to go through a bit of a shift as well. So I just wanted to get a couple of charts up, which we'll do as we go. So you can start to see all the theory we're talking about and how that comes down into a particular chart. Now, the most active degrees in the fixed signs for 2021 is that 7 to 13 degrees. That's where Uranus and Saturn are going to combine in the zodiac this year. And so, in terms of what's going on for you, if you have planets like your moon, like Gloria, or angles like the ascendant or the midheaven between 7 and 13 degrees of the fixed signs, you'll really be drawn into the Uranus Saturn story for this year. So there we go. Now, health is a bit of a theme in Gloria Steinem's chart anyway, and that's got a lot to do with the Sun and Mars, the ascendant ruling planet in the 6th house, and the aspect of the moon to there. Okay, I know there's a lot I can always say about the charts, but I try to be a little brief just for time purposes. Okay, so that's our major theme for 2021, Saturn square Uranus. You've got slides that you'll be able to review. And I should have said this at the start. My intention is to pack in as much info and insights as I can for 2021 into this presentation so that you can come back and refer to this as a resource throughout the year. So we've talked about the most important thing in terms of the major aspect. Anytime we get Saturn interacting with one of the 3 outer planets, we know we're in for a more significant year, generally speaking. But one of the standout features of 2021 is that there is more good astrology than what we had in 2020. And perhaps that's not hard given the unique challenges and extreme limitations that kind of emerged throughout 2020. The best astrology that 2021 has to offer has a lot to do with Jupiter and Pisces. And if you haven't caught this bit of astrological news yet, here are the dates for you. Jupiter will be in Pisces from May 13 to July 28th. And this is considered to be a very, very good thing, technically speaking, particularly in traditional astrology, where Jupiter is considered to be one of the 3 graces in astrology. And what that means is Jupiter is part of what brings goodness, vitality, healing, opportunity, positive energy, optimism. These are all things that Jupiter brings. And so to have Jupiter in a place where by sign placement, Jupiter is able to activate some of these topics that have been so sorely lacking, I think it's going to be quite an uplifting period where we see some hope. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you can each do to tap into that. In addition to the great Jupiter and Pisces piece, we do have Venus moving through 3 signs where she has some good stuff. And yes, Venus is in Libra, Pisces, and Taurus each year, but each year there are different things that affect her experience of being in those signs. And the one good Venus transit for 2021 is the Venus in Libra from August 16 to September 10. And it's a great question that Megan's asking in the chat. Why is Venus in Libra in 2021 so good and why wasn't it last year? In 2020, when Venus was in Libra, she was making square aspects to Mars, Saturn, and Pluto, which from a traditional astrology perspective impaired or inhibited her ability to deliver some of that sweet honey that Venus in Libra is so known for. This year, 2021, when Venus is in Libra, she will just have some trine aspects to Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, which is much more favorable and certainly it just doesn't inhibit her in the way that she was blocked last year. Venus in Pisces, the limitation of that in 2021 is that Venus will be very close to the sun in a condition known as combustion, and that will inhibit or somewhat sort of mute the ability of Venus in Pisces to be as good as she can be. But don't worry, we'll have more Venus in Pisces in the future to enjoy. But just to understand that Venus in Pisces isn't as good as Venus in Pisces can be in 2021. And similarly with Venus in Taurus this year, Venus in Taurus will, of course, be negotiating with Uranus, but more importantly, will be in a sign-based square to Saturn in Aquarius. And so that will have a somewhat kind of quality of restraint for Venus in Taurus for 2021. So I've put the dates of Venus in Pisces and Taurus there so that you can have them, and maybe you can do your own little reflective study about, which of the 3 Venus transits in 2021 you personally like the best. Sometimes that's a little dependent on our own charts, but from a purely theoretical, technical perspective, we're looking to Venus in Libra as the really good Venus transit for this year. So that's a little bit about some of that. Okay, and let's have a look at Jupiter and Pisces and just dive into this, because I think as much as it's important to talk about the major things that are going on, it's also important to make sure we understand where the good stuff could be coming from. So, Jupiter in Pisces, this is a preview of a longer trend. And so, Jupiter will be back in Pisces at the very end of the year and will spend about 5 months, the first part of 2022. I do want to say it's very important to capture what we can with Jupiter and Pisces, because Jupiter actually spends less time in Pisces than just about any other zodiac sign. We had a full 12 months of Jupiter in Sagittarius in 2019, and we get about 7.5, maybe 8 months of Jupiter in Pisces in total. So that's an important piece to do our beautiful Jupiter and Pisces things while we can, because we don't want to sleep on that. There's less time with Jupiter and Pisces to take advantage of that. So the important thing with the May to July 2021 period of Jupiter and Pisces is that is like the preview or the awakening, the first dreaming and imagining of what you might dive into more deeply in the first half of 2022 when Jupiter returns to Pisces. Jupiter transits are generally helpful and hopeful. And if you have planets at 0, 1, or 2 degrees of Pisces, you're going to get a lovely Jupiter and Pisces transit this year. So, Jupiter in Pisces, generally, this is a benefic planet in one of its home signs. So, we do get this sense of sort of a more positive astrological signature, at least for a couple of months. It's not enough to fix all the issues or dramas or problems in the world or that you might be dealing with, but it's certainly enough to alleviate suffering, if you like, or to help bring relief of some kind. We talked about the idea of Jupiter being one of the 3 graces, which is a helpful planet in healing, but also in sort of psychology and life experience. There's a soothing quality to Jupiter and Pisces. This activates a very wet quality. One of the qualities associated with the planet Jupiter is wetness. And of course, Pisces as a water sign has wetness to it. We're getting some water back into the celestial space, which we haven't had for a really long time. And that wetness and that moisture is about connection, it's about growth, and it's about life. This is a life affirming or a life enhancing combination. Now, that can be internally boosting your spirit so that you feel more engaged or hopeful or positive about life. Or it may be that it brings something into your life that just soothes you or supports your own personal growth and progress. So there is a felt or a sensitive quality here. Jupiter in Pisces is going to encourage expression of feeling. It's almost like we're ready for adventures in emotional exploration. How can we get into the feeling space? And this is where it's a very different quality of energy to Saturn in Aquarius, which is so head. So for this 2.5 months from mid-May to late July, we're all going to have an opportunity to step more into that heart space. Jupiter in Pisces is about intuiting and imagining and daydreaming. So you could think about the Pisces part of your chart and maybe just go on a little bit of a fantasy. Let your mind wander. What would soothe or support or inspire or encourage the Pisces part of your life? So just do a little bit of daydreaming there. Pisces is a sign of double benefics. And what I mean by that is the ruler of Pisces traditionally is Jupiter, and the planet exalted in Pisces is Venus. And so the only two benefic planets we have, both have special strength in Pisces. And it doesn't make Pisces a perfect sign, but it definitely makes it a sign that can offer some nourishment at a soul level, if you like. And there's a spiritual quality, of course, to Pisces. So anything that has an mystical or metaphysical quality is really going to be encouraged. You might be ready to explore or experience magic or your intuition, or even just to dive into something as simple as meditation. Um, it's definitely a cycle about letting go of control. And it's an invitation to sort of find or explore your faith. You might be drawn to trust in, the divine kind of goddesses, the higher powers. You might be more open to some of this woo-woo stuff, if you like. And the most important thing I think about Jupiter and Pisces is I think of it as this soul water, this nourishment for the inner landscape. This is not about nourishing the body. It's not what we do in Pisces, but we explore the heart. We get into all of that felt, energetic, intuitive side of life. And this, because it's double benefic, this is definitely like a less work, more play. It's about having more living in your life. So think about what will nourish the heart. Is it developing relationships? Is it bringing things like music or art or creativity or play into your life? Is it about exploring your relationship to pleasure or pursuing things that add meaning? Philosophy, astrology, other metaphysical or wisdom pathways. So there's a lot that you can do and try and explore, but just remember that we just get a very brief taste of Jupiter and Pisces this year. And that's a preview for something you can commit to more deeply or go further into in an immersion kind of way in the first part of 2022. So this is a really nice counteraction. I think we will all feel differently in that late May, June, and July period with Jupiter in Pisces. Definitely more of a soothing piece. Now, just to give you an example here, most of us doesn't, a question, I just see this quick question from Christina, I'm going to answer it. The other graces, so the three graces, we've got the Sun, Venus, and Jupiter. So they're all planets. Marsilio Ficino talks about the three graces, Sun, Venus, and Jupiter. The two benefics and the Sun, which can be a functional benefic in specific circumstances. So they're considered to be three planets that can be affirming or vitalizing. So that's a great quick question to take there. So I found the birth chart of Adele. I didn't realize we had a time. This is a B-rated time for her, which is from a biography. And the quick question about Venus to Pisces. Venus is exalted in Pisces. So Jupiter rules Pisces and Venus is exalted there. So both benefics having special signification, special power in Pisces, if you like. So yeah, Adele doesn't have Jupiter in Pisces, and most of us won't, although I can see a number of you in the chat who do. Lucky you. But Adele does have her midheaven at 1 degree Pisces, and Kamala Harris has her midheaven at 2 degrees Pisces. So both of these women, Adele and Kamala Harris, are going to have transiting Jupiter go over their midheaven in 2021. So that's kind of a no-brainer transit to say to someone, Jupiter is going over your midheaven. This happens once in 12 years. We're expecting some big things professionally. Now, we know Kamala Harris is going to have a big year professionally. She's the vice president-elect in America. So she has recently been appointed to the second highest job in her field. That's quite a big thing to have happen. And Adele, we might see, we can wait and see what the middle of the year might bring for her, whether it's new music, maybe some rescheduled tours if she was on tour and had to delay. But it'll be interesting to see what comes forward for her. Keep in mind that if we get really specific, transiting Jupiter will be on Adele's midheaven in May and July of 2021, and again in January of 2022. So remember that Jupiter goes in, will retrograde back, and then will come in again. So if you have planets at 0, 1, or 2 degrees of Pisces, you will get 3 activations of that transit, 2 in the middle of 2021 and 1 in early 2022. So have a think about if you have any planets or chart points in your birth chart from 0 to 2 degrees Pisces. And that's going to be where Jupiter is bringing some of that nourishment, some of that growth, maybe that kind of sweet support for you this year. That's definitely, I'm very, very excited about this because it's just lovely to have the major benefic planet in such a helpful place. Even just temporarily, we'll take it. Some of the areas and industries that have really suffered in 2020 have had to do with Jupiter being in such difficult condition. And I think that Jupiter in Pisces, it's not fixing everything, but from a pandemic perspective, if you like, it definitely clarifies treatment protocols, medications, and maybe even starts to let us know moving forward with groups or with travel. It's not that everything is ready to go in this May to July period, but we now know how we can do that, if you like. So it is a sense of that preview of what's to come. And here's Kamala Harris's chart with the midheaven there at 2 Pisces. Just to see that. So it was just interesting that I picked these charts for different reasons, but they both have early Pisces midheaven. So if you have your moon there, if you have Venus or any other planet in early Pisces, you're getting some lovely Jupiter support this year. Let's talk briefly about the eclipses coming up. There are going to be 4 eclipses in 2021. And they're tied to the nodes. So eclipses follow the nodes. You may or may not know that. The nodes are currently moving through Gemini and Sagittarius. We've got North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sag. I've put the dates up on the screen. It's about 18 months. And that 18-month time frame of the nodes in Gemini, Sag includes the entire year of 2021. So the quality of the nodes in Gemini and Sagittarius is very much about the search for meaning and the kind of craving for information that might prove your faith or your purpose in life. So one of the things to remember with this is that the search for meaning is something that you have to define for yourself. It's not to be defined by external standards, by cultural expectations or family expectation or pressure. Before we get into the dates and degrees of the eclipses themselves, I want you to just pay attention to the topics of the Gemini house and the Sagittarius house in your birth chart. Whether you know it or not, the nodes have been moving through this part of your chart since May of 2020. And the way the nodes activate houses in the chart is they churn and agitate. They move things through. They're sort of processing and looking to purify. They can also overstimulate. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You might be ready for some breakthroughs, or you may be contemplating some pretty big endings or even major beginnings in the Gemini and Sagittarius parts of your chart. So we personalize the nodes and therefore the eclipses by the houses that Gemini and Sag hold for us, because that's where they are in 2021. Collectively, Gemini and Sagittarius are a pair of signs about travel and about education. They're also about faith and philosophy, but really the interaction between facts and data and the things that we believe in. And so in the most previous cycle of the nodes in Gemini and Sag, we also saw a lot of damage to the travel industry. So the last time the South Node was in Sag and the North Node was in Gemini was late 2001 and all of 2002. So just to give a little bit of a forecast there, some of the limitations or restrictions in the travel industry and perhaps also in the education industry, think about how much schooling has changed in the last 6 or 7 months from your elementary primary schools through to high schools and then tertiary level education institutions like universities and colleges. I don't think we see a really great stabilizing in those areas until after the nodes leave Gemini and Sag. So we're looking at January of 2022 before we could see a return to stability or consistency in travel and education fields. And that's to do with the nodes continuing through Gemini and Sag. If you're thinking about your own personal birth chart, if you're sort of thinking, gosh, there's just so much going on around my Gemini house or my Sagittarius house, similarly, you'll get more stability around those parts of your chart in 2022. And that means all of 2021 will continue to bring changes in those areas. In my experience working with clients over the years, eclipses in mutable signs do tend to bring quite a lot more changes. The nature of these signs is that they change easily and quickly. They're very responsive to change or the shifting in the breeze. And so we're seeing that theme of change and maybe a lack of stability or consistency that we got from Saturn square Uranus. We're seeing that echoed in the eclipses this year. So some of the keywords there for the eclipses, which is sort of eclipse keywords, but also Gemini, Sag, nodal keywords, is this questioning, this craving of wisdom and knowledge, this looking for guides. Like I want, where is the meaning and the purpose and who can give it to me? But I think we have to remember that our inner wisdom is our most important. So taking in information from external sources, but seeing how it resonates within you, because you don't ever want to deny the wisdom that you hold within your own self. Okay. So the dates and the degrees of the eclipses are here. We will have one eclipse in Taurus in November. That's a full moon or lunar eclipse on November 19. Other than that, the eclipses this year will be in Gemini and Sagittarius. Our first eclipse season is in the middle of the year and has two eclipses, May 26th with a full moon or lunar eclipse at 5 Sag, and then a new moon or solar eclipse on June 10th, and that's at 19 Gemini. Then later in the year, about 6 months later, remember that eclipses happen about 6 months. Eclipse seasons tends to happen about 6 months apart. November 19 is our full moon or lunar eclipse at 27 Taurus. And December 4 will be our solar eclipse, which is a new moon event at 12 Sagittarius. Now, when we work with eclipses, there's a few pieces to bring in. The data on this slide, SN refers to South Node and NN refers to North Node. T refers to total. So there's a lot to interpret with an eclipse, and one piece is whether the moon at the eclipse is on the South Node or the North Node. That changes the way you interpret the eclipse, and whether the eclipse is a total eclipse or not. A total eclipse, which is what the T refers to, is a more dramatic visual event and tends to be more of an intense emotional or experiential event because there is more of a total covering or blocking of the light. Primarily, the eclipses are going to agitate and stir up and keep in this constant state of motion the topics of your Gemini and Sagittarius houses. And at the very end of the year, we're going to see an eclipse in Taurus, which will be the start of a new cycle of eclipses, which we're going to talk more about for 2022 when we get to it. But just so you know, most of the year is Gemini, Sag eclipses and just one Taurus eclipse at the end of the year. That Taurus eclipse is going to set us off for a cycle in 2022 where we have eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio, but we'll save that conversation for when we get closer. So here are we don't have time in a summary presentation like this webinar to go through all the charts of all the eclipses next year, but I did want to briefly show the eclipse charts from the mid-year eclipses. Now, I've used these charts for Toronto, Canada, so they're Eastern time. But just to give you a quick visual, this full moon eclipse on May 26th is at 5 degrees Sag, and you can see the full moon there. It's a total eclipse, and that's because the moon and the sun are only 5 degrees from the nodes themselves. So the closer the new or the full moon is to the nodes, the more total and therefore the more intense or dramatic the eclipse will be. Look to 5 degrees Sagittarius in your personal birth chart as the sensitive degree for that lunar eclipse. And there was something else I wanted to say about this, and it's just escaping my mind right now, which is totally fine. We'll come back to it. The south node. That's what I wanted to say. The moon at the time of the eclipse is on the south node. And so we get most of our learning, or I find them really useful info about the nodes from the Indian or Vedic tradition of astrology. And the south node is an emptying out, but also a very spiritual placement. And given that this eclipse is in Sagittarius, there's going to be a lot about teachers and gurus and wisdom and knowledge, and how do we get that, and how do we crave that, and how do we look for quality to do with that. With that South Node lunar eclipse. That's the May event. So the South Node is also a purging or a releasing quality. So letting go of things, maybe being ready to end something around the Sagittarius part of your chart, specifically at that particular eclipse. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the new moon eclipse in Gemini. It's a little bit wider to the nodes. It's about a 9-degree orb there. And so this is not a total eclipse. It's still an eclipse, but it just doesn't have that total designation. Nonetheless, it's a solar eclipse about 19 degrees Gemini. It's a north node eclipse because you can see the moon is nearest the north node. And this is a north node eclipse has a hunger or an insatiable quality. We can tend to overdo things. And so being overstimulated or overdoing it, particularly around, say, Gemini topics, information or interaction or connection, but perhaps more personally and more relevantly around the topics of the Gemini part of our chart. So if Gemini is 10th house of career for you, you might be sort of dancing between endings and beginnings, which is an eclipse thing, but you might be overdoing it as part of that transition near this particular eclipse. So that's something to keep in mind there as well. Now, eclipses affect all of us via house placement. If you have an eclipse that is very close by degree to something in your personal chart, it's going to have more of that stirring, activating, agitating quality for you. Eclipses represent portals or periods in time where we can fast track and we can break away from things. So, fast paced progress is part of it, but also the idea of being able to break away. That's also something that we can do with eclipses. So, think about eclipses as major pivots or turning points where we can go here when we normally can't, or we can go there when we normally can't, or we can have that breakaway feeling. So it is a little bit of that unexpected. I don't think eclipses are as much unexpected as they are just a lot happening in a short space of time. So that's something to keep in mind with those eclipses. And then you can apply those concepts to the eclipses that will be happening later in the year as well. So just to give you a couple of examples here, Snakes and Ladders is a great game to think about for the eclipses, particularly because snakes is something that does have a lot to do with the nodes and the idea of the dragon and things like that. So that's very eclipsy. Just to give a quick couple of examples, Adele will have the eclipses, the Gemini Sag eclipses, 6th house, 12th house. So topics to do with work versus rest, to do with physical stuff, which is 6th house, versus mental, psychological, and spiritual stuff, which is 12th house. So there'll be topics that she'll be exploring. Gloria Steinem is going to have 2nd house, 8th house eclipses. And so we're going to see, well, for her, she'll be experiencing, we may not see it, topics to do with money, income, investments, all of those practical financial topics will be stirred and agitated with those eclipses for her. And then Kamala Harris is going to have 1st house, 7th house eclipses. So dynamics to do with relationship and interacting with others, as well as about developing identity, personal growth. How are you showing up out in the world? So a lot of transition there as well. So just to give you an idea about that. for those eclipses. Just think about the house pairs. You'll get the main themes. And then if you've got anything in your chart at the specific eclipse degrees, you can just know that it's going to be more intense for you. Okie dokie. So that is our eclipse piece. So now let's dive into a few thoughts on Venus retrograde. I know we've got a lot to cover today, but that is because there's always so many fabulous things happening in the year ahead, and there is a lot happening in 2021. Somebody's asking if Gemini and Sagittarius encompasses 2 houses. If you're using like a quadrant-based house system, then you will have to actually use the degree of the eclipse to see which house it falls in specifically in your chart. The orb for eclipses to planets or chart points, I'd probably use about 3 degrees maximum for that. The nodes always move backwards. I'm just reading through a couple of questions, answering a couple of quick questions on these. The nodes always move backwards. So the eclipses which follow the nodes go backwards too. So we had eclipses last year in Cancer and Capricorn. Now we're having eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius. And next up, we'll have eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio. When you're talking about your chart, it's your natal chart is the key. Your natal chart, the houses in your natal chart are the houses to use for any and all timing work. And that's because even when you're doing progressions or perfections or other timing techniques, everything is anchored in to the houses in your natal chart. Okay, so I do have to move quickly because we've got a lot to cover. Venus retrograde in Capricorn. This is happening at the very end of 2021, but it's important. So I do want to make sure that we don't forget it. The dates and the degrees are on the screen. So Venus is retrograde for about 6 weeks. It'll be December 18 to January 28. So this is going to cross the threshold, end of 2021, early 2022. Venus will be retrograde. She'll start her retrograde at 26 Capricorn. She'll be very close to Pluto when she begins that retrograde, and she'll retrograde all the way back to 11 Capricorn. The most important cycle to remember with Venus retrograde is that Venus retrogrades happen on 8-year cycles in the same zodiac sign. So even though we have Venus retrograde in the sky every 18 months, it's every 8 years to the same sign. And this diagram here is showing you a little bit of that info. The degrees, just so you know, the dates and degrees on this diagram is when Venus retrograde conjuncts the sun. And so in January 2022, Venus will be retrograde and conjunct the sun at 18 Capricorn. So that's like the middle part of the Venus retrograde. The last time Venus was retrograde in Capricorn, late 2013 and early 2014. So when you're thinking about Venus retrograde as a timing factor, you do want to think about going back 8 years and that as a particular chapter in time. Venus spends 40 days retracing her steps through the sky. And this represents a very powerful internal process where there is a quality of retreat, of perhaps hibernation or disappearing from view, going within to review and to refocus. Venus retrograde cycles have been studied since antiquity. There is a lot of mythology built around those, and we could do a whole webinar just on them. So we're definitely just giving you the highlights today. I wanted to speak a little bit about the idea of what is Venus in Capricorn about and what might we need to do in this 6 weeks that Venus is retrograde later this year. This is very much, Venus in Capricorn explores themes of protection versus tenderness, of how we armor up and kind of defend ourselves versus showing our vulnerability. Venus in Capricorn is naturally more stoic than it is open or soft. But I think there's a question that can come up when Venus retrogrades in Capricorn around the relationship between hardness and softness, between being defended and being open and vulnerable. And it's something we can all explore based on the topics of the Capricorn house in our chart. So there are qualities here of Venus in Capricorn often being bound by fear or restraint or caution or hesitation. And when Venus retrogrades in Capricorn, we can explore our relationship to fear or to caution. Are we overly cautious or too protective? Do we have just the right kind of boundaries in the right situations? Or do we have not enough boundaries somewhere and too many boundaries elsewhere? Venus will be retrograde in Capricorn. And so it's the topics of your Capricorn house that are up for their once in 8 year review and redo. You might have noticed that Adele has a Cancer ascendant. And so Capricorn is seventh house for her. And so Venus retrograde in Capricorn is going to happen in the seventh house of relationships for Adele. So some of this reviewing and redoing is about how she relates to other people. That's something, we can just play that in mind. For Kamala Harris, Capricorn is going to be eighth house. And so Venus retrograde is going to ask her to review and explore some practical things, perhaps like taxes or finances or investments or how money is handled in her primary relationship, for instance. So while Venus is retrograde in Capricorn, we can practically want to review, give ourselves a bit of a report card about the Capricorn parts of our chart, and then think about what new structures or responsibilities we want to take on in that part of our life. It's also going to be a time to reflect on that relationship between how we hold in or hold back stuff, emotions, fears, plans, versus how we share or show affection. Keep in mind, Venus is a primary planet to do with relating and relationships. So we're looking to kind of explore commitment, to clarify the kinds of promises that are spoken and unspoken between self and others. Questions to do with, do you have to work for love, or do you feel that you're worthy of tenderness? That balance between hard and soft is likely to come up while Venus is retrograde. I wanted to mention that I won't read out this whole slide because you'll have the notes and I want to show you a couple of charts. But just to remember that Venus retrograde is a cycle of transformation, and that through the process of this particular retrograde, Venus will move from Western evening star to Eastern morning star. And so she spends a period of time invisible. That's why Venus retrograde has this wonderful theme, if you like, about retreat or descent or hiding. And when Venus meets the sun, which was the date on this chart here, January 8th, 2022, she is being purified in the fires of the sun. She's also getting her new messaging and her new mission statement for the next cycle. So there's a lot that goes on symbolically and mythologically for Venus while she's retrograde. And I think if you can take time to retreat from regular life to reflect, maybe even just to go quiet about the topics of your Capricorn house through this particular part of time, this can be a wonderful way of revisioning the next 8 year cycle, because it'll be another 8 years before Venus comes back to retrograde in your Capricorn house. I wanted to show you a little bit about this morning star, evening star business that Venus will shift around with. And so I've started the first chart here, this chart up here on the top left as I'm seeing it, but it might be top right for you, the December 15 chart. The sun is right on the ascendant and Venus is under the horizon, if you like. And that's a clue that Venus is not morning star, because if she was morning star, we would see her somewhere up here in the sky before the sun had risen. So she's an evening star in mid-December as we get close to the start of that Venus retrograde. In the middle of the Venus retrograde, this is loosely the date where we have the Venus-Sun conjunction, the middle chart. Here we go. Venus retrograde conjunct the sun. So that's the middle point, the turning point, the purification point for the sun. And so that's the transition point, if you like. Venus is very close to the sun, so we can't see her whether she's morning or evening star there. And by the time we get to our final diagram over here, where we get to early February 2022, this is after the Venus retrograde. We see the sun on the ascendant, and now we can see Venus above the sun in the early morning sky. That is Venus coming through as the morning star there. So just to see that relationship of Venus to the sun, it's a little tricky to see in the flat diagram, and I know I'm just doing it quickly, but I wanted to at least point out this idea of transition with that. I don't personally use the Venus second house connection that I know is very popular in modern astrology. So I would really think about Venus retrograde as being relevant to the topics of the Capricorn house in your birth chart. That's where the Venus retrograde will take place. The other part, the other chart that is worth, I just want to get Adele's chart back. Let me see if I can do this here. So if we use Adele just as a very quick example here, Venus retrograde will be happening in the 7th house because it's happening in Capricorn, and that's where she has the sign of Capricorn. Venus rules 2 signs. And so from a traditional astrology perspective, Venus retrograde would talk about reflection and redoing around the Taurus part of our chart and around the Libra part of our chart. So if you want to think about the most personal topics for you when Venus is retrograde, think about the Capricorn house, which is where the retrograde's happening, and then think about the topics of your personal Taurus and Libra house, because for Adele, Taurus is 11th house to do with friends, and Libra is 4th house to do with home and family. So they will probably be topics that she is also reviewing, kind of wanting to reconstruct essentially through this particular retrograde. Okay, so we've taken a wonderfully detailed tour through the skies for 2021, and we've covered a lot of data. I want to take a few minutes here just to give you some tips about anchoring it into your own chart. So the hotspot degrees for the major transiting planets, these are not necessarily large collective 2021 themes, but if they are relevant to your chart, it's going to be major for you in 2021. So the degrees that each of the slower moving planets, Saturn and the outer planets, that they're going to cover in 2021 are listed. Pay special attention to these dates in bold in the brackets. These are the dates that are the degrees, I should say, the degrees that are newly activated by that planet in 2021. So what I mean by this, let's look at Uranus briefly. If you have a planet at 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 degrees of Taurus or any of the fixed signs, you've been having a Uranus transit since April, May of 2020. What Uranus is doing that's new for 2021 is activating the degrees from 11 to 14 degrees of Taurus. And that will have a spin-off effect to 11 to 14 degrees of the other fixed signs. That's going to be new. That's the start of a different cycle and a new shift, a new energetic influence for you for this year. Neptune is not a huge feature in the major signatures for 2021, but if you have a planet at 21, 22, or 23 degrees of any of the mutable signs, Pisces, Gemini, Virgo, or Sagittarius, you're going to be having a pretty big Neptune transit, and that's going to be big news for you personally. Similarly with Pluto, Pluto is starting to activate 25 and 26 degrees of Capricorn, which will also influence planets at 25 or 26 degrees of Aries, Libra, and Cancer. And while that may not be a major collective signature for 2021, that's certainly going to be huge for you if that's relevant to your personal astrology chart. So just keep those in mind. It's a lot of matching. It's a bit like it's not quite like the memory game that my little niece plays, but this is the degrees that the planets are activating. What are they doing in your personal chart? And of course, anytime you have a planet or a point like the ascendant, the midheaven, the IC, or the descendant, anytime you have a planet or point that's in the pathway of one of those major planets, Saturn and the outers, it's a huge event for you personally. So you want to take note of that. Maybe one of the eclipse degrees is triggering your midheaven, for instance. So that blue sort of box is the most significant things that might be happening for you is when you get a direct degree-based activation by one of the transiting planets or the eclipses or even the Venus retrograde. The green box kind of covers things that will affect all of us, and it's how we personalize the general themes of the year ahead. And this is when we look at the topics of the houses that the planets and eclipses will activate. So even if you don't have planets at 7 to 13 degrees of the fixed signs, I don't, but I have Taurus somewhere in my chart and I have Aquarius somewhere in my chart, and I know those two areas of my life are going to be kind of vying for attention and certainly quite busy in the year ahead. So you can think about how these planetary activations, what they touch and where they touch things in your chart. Now, just to do a quick wrap up on Adele's chart here, we can see that she doesn't, like most of us, she doesn't have Saturn in Aquarius or Jupiter in Pisces, but of course she's going to be affected by the planets this year. We've talked about how Jupiter will go over her midheaven. What we also need to mention is that Saturn's coming into her 8th house. So this is a big cycle to do with financial planning, just by Saturn coming into her Aquarius 8th house. But more specifically by degree, Saturn is going to square Jupiter. We know Uranus is going to come through and hit 13 degrees of Taurus as well. Uranus will station retrograde at 14 Taurus, so it's not quite going to get to the sun in Taurus this year, but certainly one part of that very important conjunction is going to be activated for this year for her. We talked about the Venus retrograde being in the 7th and the eclipses happening across the 6th and 12th houses. So as you look at your chart, you can start to sort of draw on your chart and highlight the houses and any planets there that are getting these direct activations from the planets in 2021. This is taking you through a lot of the data and the details of what's going on in 2021. I know what many of you are most interested in is the interpretation. This is just a summary slide that we looked at before. The more that you know about the planets, the more detailed and nuanced and rich your forecasting can be. I know we're going to take some questions shortly, but now that we've considered where in the sky and which parts of the zodiac are going to be activated this year, particularly think about your Gemini, Sagittarius houses, your Taurus, Leo houses, and your Capricorn and Pisces houses. They're sort of the featured ones that I'm really honing in on as I'm thinking about the year ahead. You've got the degrees there. So when you think about that quote that we started with, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? We don't have to change every part of our life right away, but you've got a short list now of maybe 4 or 5 or 6 parts of your birth chart that speak to different topics that you could make some changes in. You could go wild or create freedom or amaze and astonish yourself if you so desire for the year ahead. So I hope this is a resource you'll be able to return to and get some keywords and concepts as well as dates and details for the year ahead. So Tony, let's take some questions, shall we? If we
Sure
have
thing.
time.
Yeah. If you have time for us, we'll ask you some questions. This one's
Yes.
from Bobby, who says, "Thanks for this. It's a great way to start the new year. I'm sure this will get covered, but I'm wondering if I'm wondering about the role Uranus and Taurus will have this year when it aspects other planets." And I wanted to dovetail that with someone who asked a question about the Uranus-Saturn square, and wondering if you had any thoughts about that in terms of climate change.
Yeah, great questions. So the big theme for 2021 is that Uranus will square Saturn. So that's the big outer planet activation. I think the Uranus in Taurus cycle is the one that I think has a lot more to do with climate change. And so with Saturn in Aquarius, there's something about the collective systems or structures or procedures, the rules and regulations that we're all bound by or that we all agree to. And I think we're going to see that into playing more with climate change topics this year. So it's almost like Saturn in Aquarius is like, okay, what are we doing about this climate change thing that has become such, it's not like we just heard about it in the last few years, but it's certainly taken on a much more significant place in the larger conversation. So I do think we'll see more there. The other thing I want to mention on the Uranus in Taurus is that also has a lot to do with food supply, food technology, food distribution, and transport. So I think it's systems and structures that are going to support dealing with climate change, but also how that interacts with food and food distribution around the globe. I think those things go together.
Thanks, Kelly. Sasha says, I'm curious about any relation with Mercury and all the Mercury retrograde in air with the state of the world with schools, particularly elementary schools. Is that too much of a stretch?
Um, it might be just a tiny bit, although I can definitely follow the thinking. There's definitely a logic there. Jupiter, I think, is the planet that really speaks to education and educational systems as a whole. And so Jupiter was in some very technically difficult, a very technically difficult state in 2020, being with Saturn and being in the sign of its fall. And so I think that's caused a lot of the major issues or problems, and it's not solved yet. Jupiter in Aquarius is a step in the right direction in that some of the technical challenges Jupiter's been dealing with, one of them has improved, but we really need Jupiter to move out of Aquarius for good, for education to get the celestial or astrological support that will help bring things maybe back into a place of more stable or consistent function. We'll get a taste of that in that May to July period in 2021, but it's really 2022 that we're looking to for that.
Thanks, Kelly. Lots of positive feedback coming in through the chat window. So thanks so much for that,
Thanks
folks.
so
I'm
much,
really,
everyone.
really glad you enjoyed the presentation, and thanks. We really appreciate the positive feedback as well. Okay, so Jenia asked, my question is about the eclipse in this year's eclipse in Sag and Gemini. How would this affect a birth chart with the reverse, someone who has a Sagittarius North Node and a Gemini South Node? Is it more intense for these folks?
It's a great question. Yeah. So to get a little bit more specific there, every 8 years or so, every 9 years or so, the nodes are back in the same pair of signs, but reversed. So when I mentioned 2001, 2002, that was the specific North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sag that we've got now. But 2012, we had North Node in Sag, South Node in Gemini. So yes, I think it's probably a little bit more relevant. You know, if you are someone who has your nodes in Gemini and Sag, either way, this is a little bit more of a stirring that you're familiar with, if you like.
Thanks, Kelly. Liza, I'm not sure what your question was in the context it was in, but she asked around 10:15, how do progressions come into play, or do they?
Great question. I can give a brief answer there. So in terms of you defining your personal themes and astrological trends for the year ahead, you would want to factor in your progressions, your perfections, maybe your Phaedaria, in addition to the transits that we covered today. So they would be part of your personal story that you would want to add in for sure.
Thanks, Kelly. Elizabeth says, do you pay attention to the progressed sun in relation to the active degrees and progressed Mercury as well?
Yeah, so if you are working with progressions, you can certainly look at what is being triggered there. I don't want to answer too many questions on progressions because we'll end up doing a whole other talk. But definitely look at your progressions for your own personal timing factors.
And I'll just say shout out for the future.
Yes.
Kelly's working on a book on progressions. So hopefully we'll have that out this year.
Yes,
if
fingers crossed.
If all goes
and
well.
we do have a couple
Fingers
of courses
crossed.
on progressions if people want more about that just in general.
Yeah, definitely. Shadi says, what are your thoughts about the dominant air energy this year in relation to virus spread, both in terms of COVID, but also technological viruses?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I did touch on this in a previous talk, the Jupiter-Saturn collective shift a couple of years ago, but it is associated with the spread of viruses. So air spreads all things, good things and bad things, and we're seeing that already. So I think it is something to be aware of and to be watchful for and to be cautious about for sure.
Thanks, Kelly. Marcia asks, is there a subtle interpretive distinction given that Saturn is the planet overcoming Uranus in the square? I was born with a Saturn-Uranus square in 1951, but Uranus in Cancer was the overcoming planet then.
Great question, Marsha. I'm not 100% sure because the overcoming concept, as you know, comes to us from some of our most ancient forms of astrology, and its intention and construct is around working with the visible planets. So I'm not as clear on whether the overcoming factor is a feature when one of the planets in the aspect is an outer planet. It's definitely a factor if we're talking about, Saturn in Aquarius overcoming Venus in Taurus, for instance. It's one of the reasons why Venus in Taurus is not going to be so good for the next couple of years. But I'm still in the observing phase around that when there's an outer planet involved. So we can watch and see, I guess.
Okay, great. Ashlyn is asking about orbs. If you have a planet at 4 and 5 degrees, would that first transit impact those since they're within 3 degrees?
I think this might be about Jupiter and Pisces. I'm just guessing. If it is, probably not as much because we really want Jupiter to come to 4 and 5 Pisces for whatever you have at 4 and 5 Pisces. Don't worry, I have stuff there too, so I'm hanging out for that. But it's like you get a little taste. It's almost like when you watch a preview of a movie, you get a sense or a feel of it, but you don't get the full experience. So that probably applies even if it's not to Jupiter and Pisces. Yeah, you want the transiting planet to come to the exact degree to get the full activation.
Thanks, Kelly. And Aaron asked if you could give some advice to folks who will be experiencing their midlife Uranus opposite Uranus transit at the same time as the Uranus-Saturn square.
I actually feel like this definitely needs attention, and I won't do it justice in this very brief response. But yeah, there's a group of people born in the early 70s off the top of my head who have Saturn in Leo and Uranus in Scorpio. And this Saturn Uranus square is going to directly activate that by degree. So I think this just makes it, if you have a Saturn Uranus square in your natal chart, you're a person who's already familiar with this quality of like rebellion versus repression, if you like, and the extent to which you have resolved or made peace with or found a way to express that energy in your life, the extent to which you can kind of go further into that in 2021. If you're kind of stuck in the Saturn part of that square, then perhaps this year is when we really get more of that Uranus freedom coming as well.
Thanks, Kelly. And Ellen asked if the Saturn-Uranus conjunction might have an impact on the economy and terms of market crashes and things like that.
Look, I'm not an expert on the market side of things, but from what I understand, it is supposed to be quite a volatile time with markets and things like that. So we do expect more upheaval with that. And the other thing I think on the markets that maybe is not great is I just would like Jupiter to get out of a Saturn ruled sign. So traditionally Saturn rules Aquarius and Capricorn. And this 2-year period where Jupiter goes through the contraction part of its cycle, but it's in the contraction signs, does tend to have some consolidation going on. And I think Saturn square Jupiter, it's naturally going to just add a little bit more volatility. We don't like volatility in Saturn things, and the financial markets is one of those things.
Thanks for that. And I just popped in a little thing in the chat window for those who want to learn more.
Yeah.
Ray Merriman is somebody who's has a whole team that studies various stock markets, and it's like Kelly said, it's not her area of specialty. So if you want more info about that from somebody who does study it every week, you might head over to their website. Hariana asked, are night charts going to do as well with Jupiter in 2021?
Great question. I think that both day and night charts can benefit from Jupiter and Pisces. It's a very subtle, like, are you getting less? I mean, if you're a night chart, but Pisces is an angular house for you, you're still going to get some of the goodness. I mean, it's, you get 3/4 of it maybe instead of 100%, but you're still going to get some good stuff for sure.
Thanks, Kelly. You answered the orb question earlier, didn't you?
I think so. Yeah, we said about 3 degrees.
Yeah, for eclipse orbs. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then Nicole asked, if a north node eclipse happens on your south node, does that mean they would cancel each other out?
If the north node eclipse happens on your south node, that's a great question. I don't think it'll cancel it out. I think it's just going to be this weird hyperstimulation of overdoing it and extreme letting go all at the same time.
Okay, Kristen asked if you have any thoughts on Venus retrograde going back over the 22 Saturn-Pluto conjunction critical degree.
I don't think I have a lot of thoughts on that. It is, I think, from a personal perspective, if you have planets at those degrees, it's like we're not quite done yet with figuring that out. That's probably what I'd be looking at.
Thanks, Kelly. Meg wonders how significant you think a full moon lunar eclipse would be on the part of fortune.
My first instinct is to say not that significant, but then I would watch and see. I don't think I'd have a strong expectation, but I would be open and observing.
Okay, and we have a fertility question. And Britt, if you haven't heard Kelly's fertility webinar, you might want to check that one out. I think if you just type in the search box on her website for Kelly, or sorry, for the word fertility, it'll pop right up. So Britt asked, Jupiter is my benefictive sect and rules my 5th house and 2nd house. Would the Jupiter in Pisces transit be a good time to try to conceive? I should probably mention that my Jupiter is in Leo.
Okay. Look, having transiting Jupiter go through the 5th would generally be a good time to conceive. In fact, it's one of those transits that if I have a client who is in biological childbearing years, I'll actually say this is something just to be aware of. You know, you may or may not be wanting to have kids, but it's something that is a possibility. And that's with Jupiter transiting the 5th, and especially if Jupiter's going to be in Pisces in the 5th. There are other things that I would look at in the chart, some stuff in the progress chart, and also what's going on with your moon. But yes, just at a, without considering those other factors, normally I would say go for it with transiting Jupiter in the 5th.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Do you have any quick thoughts you can share about Venus retrograding over a natal Venus?
I think it's probably just an opportunity to go deeper into what Venus in Capricorn means for you. Keep in mind, this happens every 8 years. So if you do have Venus between 11 and 26 degrees of Capricorn, you've had this transit before. And so really diving into your relationship to things like attractiveness, to partnership, to bonding, desire, all of those kind of Venus-y words, you could figure out maybe what's holding you back and to see, are you doing as much as you could or would like to in that area?
Thanks, Kelly. And Megan asked, do you think that the Venus in Capricorn at the beginning of 2021 will initiate themes of what Venus in Capricorn at the end of the year will bring up?
It's possible. And I think if you're astute and really quite aware, you might get a little bit of a taster at the start of the year. Or even just you could be reminded of what Venus in Capricorn kind of means in the context of your personal chart. So you might get a little bit of a heads up.
All right. Aditi says, would you consider aspects from transiting eclipse nodes to natal eclipse nodes when looking at potential events, topics, or areas of focus?
So transiting eclipse nodes to natal nodes. I do use the transiting nodes, so separate to the eclipses, but I do definitely pay attention. If the transiting north node is conjunct a planet in your chart, or the transiting south node is conjunct. I use conjunctions mostly with the transiting nodes, but I do use them as transit things, just like I would use Saturn or Uranus. So yes, definitely work with that.
Constanza asks if you think Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces could correlate with flooding.
Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces, that's getting a heads up on the 2022 presentation. Some flooding, yes. There will be an excess of wetness, which could show up in terms of climate with water and stuff to do with water and water quality. But I also think we'll see it in terms of a real focus on mystical things and feelings as well.
Thanks, Kelly. Susan's asking if you use the phase aspects concept, and wondering if you take into account that Saturn and Uranus are in a waning square.
Yeah, I think that is worth. That was one of the pieces that I looked at, and then for time purposes, decided not to talk a lot about today. But it is a waning square. We're actually in the Saturn Uranus conjunction that we're in now is the one that started in 1988 when Saturn and Uranus were in late Sag together. And so this waning square relates to the mid 70s. So if you're looking for when was the last time we had Saturn square Uranus in that waning square relationship, it's basically 75 to 77. And it was Leo Scorpio at that time. So, yes, I think that's relevant. And that probably feeds into themes to do with like the breaking down of structures. That's what we do at the waning square. We're in sort of the disintegration and it's the autumn going into winter kind of phase. So yes, that would definitely be part of it.
Thanks, Kelly. Samantha has Aquarius on the ascendant with Jupiter crossing soon and wonders if you could say a few words about Jupiter crossing the ascendant.
Jupiter on the ascendant is I love it. The one possible problem can be weight gain, to be very clear from a health or a medical astrology perspective. But most of the time, people with Jupiter on the ascendant or in the first do get that lovely sense of self confidence that can be a revitalizing or a health improving quality that goes with Jupiter there. Uh, Rediscovering a sense of thirst for life, or even the idea of focusing on personal growth and self development. The only caution, of course, is depending on what degree your Aquarius ascendant is, you will have Saturn there either this year or next year. And Saturn can be about, having to put in some of the effort or really do good maintenance and self care rituals and routines. So it's not a standard Jupiter ascendant transit this year because Saturn's there, at least in the same sign.
Thanks for that. Diane was asking about the slide deck. So Diane, we give you access to the video to download and also the slides. So you'll get that in your account later today. So you can just log into your account. I'd say probably around 5 p.m. or so. We say to wait for up to 24 hours, but we usually get it done the same day. And that's, I'm on mountain time.
Okay.
Okay. Lorraine was asking if you can say anything more about the virus this year and what you see in the transits this year correlating with the virus.
Um, Generally trending towards improving in terms of the virus's impact on everyone. And I think we've already seen the start of that in terms of there now being a number of vaccinations that are available, as well as the fact that treatments for the more severe cases are becoming a little bit more effective, or there's more information there. So I'm really tracking Jupiter and Pisces for this, or the Jupiter. I'm looking at Jupiter for this. And so Jupiter into Aquarius is like, oh, these are the first things that are going to help us move forward. And then Jupiter and Pisces will be the next step. And just keeping in mind that we get a taste of that May to July, but it's really end of December this year that Jupiter is out of the cosmic woods. And I think at that point, we will have a real sense of how we move forward, knowing, that the virus is out there, but by that point, having some much more effective protocols in place to manage it.
Great, thanks, Kelly. And that kind of takes us to the end. I know there's a few more questions, and if Kelly's willing to hang out afterwards, we can maybe chat a little bit more. But before we go, I just wanted to give Kelly a little bit of time to tell you about her upcoming retreat and also her monthly membership, if you aren't familiar with it, because if you liked what Kelly did today, and I know for a lot of you saying so in the chat, this was your first experience with an overview for the whole year. Kelly does a lot of this in more detail in her monthly astrology guide. So Kelly, you want to tell folks about both of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So the monthly astrology guide is a special sort of subscriber section where I do weekly videos and talk about every aspect. So if you are someone who likes that heads up, we drop a month ahead package on the first of the month, and you get a video for each week of the month. You get some overview tips, and you get some check your chart video, which I go through a couple of members' charts showing them how the astrology of the month will influence them. So if you're looking to learn astrology and or get better at timing astrology, the Astrology Guide monthly membership is an excellent resource for you. And then our retreat. So normally Tony and I meet together in Palm Springs in January, and we take a small group of people through some deep dive year ahead planning with astrology. And so this year we're taking that online. So that will be happening January 15, 16, and 17. I'm going to be teaching the timing technique of Fidaria, which has a funny sounding name, but is really fun and inspiring to learn. So I'm going to take everyone through that. So you'll get a sense of what the hell this technique is and how it might apply to your life experiences from a timing perspective. And then we'll go through the year ahead cycles for your chart in more detail. So we keep our retreat at a more intimate level. There's only 36 students and we're about half sold, I think, Tony. I know we have a few spots left. So if you are interested, you can sign up for that. The monthly membership guide's on my website, kellysastrology.com, and the year ahead retreat is on the Astrology University website. And Tony's just popping the links in there. So the retreat is called Personal Predictions for 2021. So we'll spend 3 days together. You'll kind of step out of your regular routine and we'll do some deep dive planning, exploration. We have a lot more time in the retreat to go into some of the meaning and the interpretations of the different transits. And we really look forward to that each year. We've got a community of students who return each year, and we have some new students that join us. So if that's of interest to you, if you'd like a really special experience to get into what this might mean for you. The retreat is ideal for intermediate astrology students. So it's good if you already have an understanding of the planets and birth chart interpretation. You'll get the most out of it at that level. So I think they're the two biggies.
Yeah, definitely. I just popped in. It looks like we have 13 spots left. So if you're interested, you might want to grab one of those sooner than later because
oh wow, that's been a bit of a flurry in the last few days.
Yeah, we'll run out very shortly, maybe today. Thanks for that. And thanks everybody for being here. If you have any, we always check out our calendar for upcoming events. We have lots of things coming up. We have a webinar with Kara Sutherland, I think is our next one. She's going to kind of do her health overview for 2021, I think. And so tune in for that, for some nice practical health related tips. If some of that new energy that Kelly described today is happening in your 6th house, that might be a great webinar to check out for you.
6th house, 1st house, 12th house for mental health. There's quite a few houses that can they can get us.
Definitely.
Or even stuff to the moon. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm in the Aquarius 12th house camp, so I'll be doing lots of meditation, reflection. Yeah. I was thinking awesome. The 12th house is the writing cave, but that could just be me.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you. And thanks everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for now. Thanks for being here and we will see you again soon. And thanks so much, Kelly.
Thanks everyone.